Is the world being fed a lie about Gaza? While headlines scream famine, the truth is far more twisted. In this episode, we uncover how Al Jazeera and liberal media are fueling a false narrative, ignoring the millions of meals entering Gaza, the fuel flowing in, and Hamas's brutal theft of aid. Meanwhile, the UN lets trucks full of food rot in the sun, all to maintain control. And while Israel is blamed, it's Hamas pulling the trigger on its own people. Then, 28 countries demand Israel halt the war, and Hamas couldn't be more thrilled. What does this mean for the future of the conflict? Coming up on Israel Undiplomatic.
Shalom and welcome to another episode of Israel Undiplomatic. I'm here with my co-host, Ruthie Blum. I'm, of course, Mark Regev, and welcome to another episode. We have much to talk about.
Hello, Mark. Yes, we do have a lot to talk about, especially the blood libel of the fake famine going on in Gaza with everybody supposedly starving. And the reason we want to talk about that is that I'm sure there are some people hungry there, but certainly not those being advertised on Al Jazeera and CNN, and may I add, Israeli television channels as well. And I'm just going to give you one example, and then I'm handing the floor to you. A video clip has been circulating, again, started by Al Jazeera, Qatar's mouthpiece. In this video, a mother is by the hospital bed of her 4-year-old daughter, or allegedly, okay? This is my daughter. She's malnourished. That's why she's sick in the hospital, etc. And then the next scene is a man carrying out a bundle that looks like a very large, long hot dog or something wrapped in a white sheet. And we're supposed to believe that that is that 4-year-old girl in that sheet. She died of starvation. Now, what nobody seems to notice is that in that very clip, the mother is obese. So if it's true, now we don't know, maybe her daughter really was ill, but if her daughter was dying of starvation in that hospital bed, then it's her mother who was stealing her food, may I point out. And second of all, no child wrapped in a sheet is shaped like a 6-foot-long hot dog. So I would say what we're seeing is the constant uncritical analysis of every lie perpetrated by Hamas and its mouthpiece, Al Jazeera.
So let's start with something you mentioned at the very beginning of your remarks, where you said, you know it's not easy for the civilian population of Gaza. And the civilian population of Gaza has been in a war zone now, what is it?
Almost 2 years.
Almost 2 years. And it's not easy, okay? No one would want to trade places with the civilian population of Gaza, except maybe one of the Israeli hostages who's in Gaza, who their conditions are no doubt worse. But without minimizing that, and I don't think we should minimize the fact that it's very difficult for the civilians in Gaza, there's no doubt that there is a organized campaign by Hamas and people who support Hamas to play up the level of human suffering for political reasons. And we can go through the list. It's clear Hamas has an interest in doing so. It's clear Hamas wants to say that Israel is committing genocide and there's mass starvation, and unless the war stops tomorrow, thousands of people are going to die of starvation. Why? Because Hamas wants the war to stop, because we are winning. Militarily, every day Hamas its military machine is being more and more dismantled. And so, of course, they want that to stop, and they understand one of the ways for that to stop is for international pressure on Israel to stop, because there is a so-called humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And here, I'd like our viewers and listeners to understand one thing. Gaza is not a democracy. Hamas is not a democratic political movement. Hamas is an autocracy/totalitarian regime, because it's also extremely ideological. There is no real independent civil society in Gaza. There are no independent Gazan journalists in Gaza, because if you work in Gaza, you have to play by Hamas's rules. Unless you play by Hamas's rules, you won't have a job, or maybe worse, you won't have a life. Hamas deals very brutally with its opposition. So the pictures that we see coming out of Gaza are the pictures that Hamas wants to see. And if the pictures aren't exactly what Hamas wants you to see, either they won't come out or they'll change the pictures, and they can play with the visual image, as you've suggested they've done in that case. I'm not familiar with that particular case, but I have no doubt that Hamas plays with the visuals, and that Hamas can control the visuals coming out of Gaza. And any Gaza Palestinian, whether they're a journalist, so forth, claiming to be a journalist, or whether they're a doctor or a nurse, they are part of the Hamas machine, because there is no independent civil society in the Gaza Strip. Then you add to that all the UN institutions that have been taken over by Hamas, that Hamas can dominate. And then you have this cacophony, this message coming out of Gaza, which is basically, there's human suffering, but they turn that into genocide. They turn that into mass starvation, and people believe it.
Well, it's, for one thing, whatever starvation, whatever suffering the Gazans are undergoing, it's all because of Hamas. All Hamas had to do was not invade Israel, not take hostages, not slaughter, rape, behead, etc. And by the way, many Gazan civilians participated in that. And you pointed out journalists and doctors. We know from released hostages that many were held in the homes of doctors and journalists, so-called, and even UN officials from UNRWA. Now, because of this, now, aside from the fact that no country in wartime has ever done this, has ever fed the population of the country it's at war with, never, all right? Israel's doing that. Finally, in order to prevent Hamas from stealing all the aid, the food, the aid, selling it at exorbitant prices to Gazans and all of that. Aside from that, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was created. It's a private American enterprise with Israeli help. It was really successful at separating the distribution from Hamas. Not 100% successful, because we've seen they've also been, their cargo has also been attacked by Hamas, but designating areas for the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation with the help of the Israel Defense Forces, soldiers protecting them, to distribute millions and millions of food baskets for families. And that was going well. And lo and behold, because of talks, partly because of talks that are going now in Qatar for the release of the hostages and a ceasefire deal, which so far have gone nowhere, naturally, thanks to Hamas, the UN is angry that is the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation distributing food, and successfully. And it has hundreds and hundreds of trucks with food and medication rotting in the sun. Does anyone realize how hot it is right now? We know how hot it is in Israel. And Gaza has the same temperature, even hotter, very, very hot, sitting in the sun, because the UN workers are, there's a political fight over, they want to distribute the food and not the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. It's an outrage, okay, as though they care about the starving Gazans. But I will also say, I'd like to point out, there are other videos that Al Jazeera, of course, does not broadcast, nor does the BBC or CNN or any of the hostile, anti-Israel media outlets. And those are of the restaurants in Gaza with meat and ice cream and hummus and people going to those restaurants. You don't see that. Nor do you see or you see it, but nobody has mentioned how many overweight Gazans are in the videos of them either marching towards the food trucks or demonstrating, whatever. They're dressed well and they are not at all emaciated. Now, you could say they're all Hamas, because Hamas doesn't wear uniforms except when it's having some kind of formal ceremony. So maybe they're all Hamas. But we have to say that the serious effort to feed Gazans who are not Hamas, how many of those are there or how many there, we don't know, was successful. But the UN came in and screwed it up all over again.
So the UN is complicit because I said there's no civil society in Gaza. It's an authoritarian / totalitarian regime. And Hamas can infiltrate all the different and control, the different UN organizations working in Gaza. And the best example is one of the reasons food isn't going into Gaza at the level that Israel would want to see is because the UN truck drivers who take the food in are on strike or have been striking. And then you have to ask questions like, and who controls the union of the truck drivers that work for the UN? Hamas, just as Hamas controls the union of the UNRWA staff, right? That's what happens when you don't have independent civil society. That's when you have a regime that power comes out of the barrel of a gun, to quote Mao Zedong, yes? These are the people who can control these organizations. And so these organizations, though, may have someone from Europe or from somewhere else that heads the organization, but the staff on the ground is, of course, controlled, manipulated by Hamas. And it's not just Hamas steals the aid for itself. It does. It's not just that Hamas sells that back to the population at huge prices to make a profit so they can keep their military machine in action of some sort, which is true. It's not just that. Through its control of the UN aid network, that's one of the ways they stay in power, because this is their ability to control civil society in Gaza, their ability to be in charge of, directly or indirectly, through manipulation, through force, through other means, to be in control. And it's actually interesting. In the hostage negotiations, which may be successful, may not be successful, going on now, one of the Hamas demands has been that to stop the Israeli-American system of distributing aid and to only use the UN system. So let's ask even the people who are a bit critical of Israel. Is Hamas doing that because they're suddenly humanitarians, or it's because of political reasons? They want the UN system and only the UN system because the UN system they have infiltrated and they can manipulate, and that's part of their power structure. And when Israel and the United States came with this opposing system, that's a threat to them. That's a threat to their political power. That's a threat to their control, and therefore they're against it. And that the UN has allied itself with Hamas because it's their system. And so they say the Israeli-American system is terrible, it can never work, and it's precisely for that reason we have to make it work. Because if you want Hamas not to rule Gaza, you have to destroy its ability to control the civilian population through aid.
Now, I just would like to correct or add to something. There are words you use in relation to Hamas that I would like to, for example, well, they're, totalitarian. This is all, it's political motives. No, they are jihadi, terrorists. It's not political motives. It's radical Islamist ideological motives. And using the word political in relation to them, or sort of political system language in relation to them, is almost to talk about them in a Western framework. So I don't ever talk about Hamas that way. Now, another important thing is, and this is what's so sad, Hamas is basically finished. Israel really did finish Hamas, all its leaders, not all of it. It still has extensive tunnels, but every day the IDF has been destroying more tunnels and killing more terrorists. But here's the trouble. If there weren't hostages left in Gaza, we could have finished this job a long time ago because, and yes, it's true, some civilians would be killed in the crossfire. There's no getting around that. But the real problem here is that they don't even need actual Hamas leaders. The leaders sitting in Qatar, living in 5-star hotels and eating caviar or whatever, they don't necessarily have real connection with whoever is pulling the trigger in Gaza right now, and they're also hiding in tunnels, etc. And I don't know how good their internet is or their phone systems. So you have a negotiation going on with an entity that doesn't really have the authority to do, and doesn't have any interest, by the way, in making a deal. But what's worse is that if we end up doing a ceasefire according to the United States manages to broker this ceasefire deal for 60 days, you don't even need a leadership in Gaza. You have a few bloodthirsty terrorists. Some are Hamas, some are Islamic Jihad. There are other factions as well who just grab weapons and they go out. We're seeing this now in areas where IDF soldiers are operating. A guy grabs an RPG, goes out on his own. He's just killing, or they plant roadside bombs and they booby trap tunnels. You don't even need to have the great leader Sinwar alive for that. And that's what's so dangerous, because if there's a ceasefire, they'll all come scurrying out of the woodworks. Terrorists who are connected, not connected, with a leader, not with a leader. They are going to fight to the death. They're a suicide cult. They're a homicidal cult. And they're the genocidal ones.
Before we totally leave the issue of the humanitarian, I want to share a story with you. I remember when I was working in government at the beginning of the war, it was either late October 23 or the beginning of November. We had a meeting with a bunch of people from European countries, government officials, who said Israel had to do more on the humanitarian side. But they said to us, the picture isn't as bad as the humanitarian groups in Gaza are painting it, but we don't want it to get that way. And I would remind everyone, these were European diplomats, not necessarily natural friends of Israel, who were saying that the humanitarian groups are exaggerating. This is already at the very beginning, October 2023, November 2023. We were already then hearing mass humanitarian crisis. And it was clear, we heard then from, the people who were trying to bring more aid into Israel, saying we know they're exaggerating. And they've been exaggerating all along for political reasons, and that people believe, right? These, unfortunately, the UN says, people are dying in Gaza from starvation. People believe it. The UN has a certain credibility among certain populations.
Yeah, among anti-Israel, anti-America populations who buy any crap they're fed on purpose. Third world countries. The UN is a hotbed of disgusting representatives. I'm sorry.
No, the UN is...
Oh, they just believe it innocently. It's not innocent.
Ruthie, I agree, of course, 100% that the United Nations is systematically biased against Israel. You only have to see what goes on at the so-called Human Rights Council. You'd see the block votes at the General Assembly against Israel. What I am arguing, that in large parts of the world, not with Ruthie Blum, not with Mark Regev, not with many people in Israel and not with many people in the United States, but across the planet, across Africa, Asia, across progressives, the UN has this. It's like the gold standard. It's like the Secretary General of the United Nations is like the secular pope for many people, right? If he says there's a humanitarian problem in Gaza, people believe him. And that's why it's important for us to explain how the UN in Gaza and as an institution has been manipulated, has been taken over by Hamas. On the larger issue of UN bias against Israel, it's not just Ruthie Blum and Mark Regev who said the UN's got it wrong on Israel. Two, and I think I've said this before on the program, two former Secretary Generals of the United Nations, Kofi Annan and after him Ban Ki-moon, both publicly addressed the issue of anti-Israel bias in the United Nations structure. So if they can say it, I think most people of goodwill can understand there's a real problem here.
Yes, that's right. And too bad the Israeli journalists on the left over here, and there are many of them, are not picking up and selling that line to everybody rather than explaining the truth. They are just repeating it. They're repeating Hamas's talking points. And then, as you talk about people who don't pay that much attention to politics or world, or I don't know, international relations. Well, look, you see, renowned Israeli journalists are saying it. It's outrageous. And I just don't believe that explaining to people actually helps. What we need to do is win the war. Winning wars helps. It always has throughout history. The victory would make a difference. And right now we have a problem. But you did mention Europe. And I think this is where you want to talk about something else egregious that Europe just did with Hamas's blessing.
Well, just 2 days ago, 28 countries, most of them Europeans, some of them unserious countries like Ireland, which we don't have to take seriously at all. They're so out there and hostile to Israel. But countries like Britain, France, Austria, Italy, um, uh, 28, but that includes non-European countries like Canada and Australia and Japan and New Zealand, have put out a statement. UK, I should say, of course, they're no longer an EU country. They are calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. And of course, they say we need this immediate ceasefire precisely for the reasons they believe, or they want to believe, or they've been told to believe the Hamas propaganda about a mass starvation happening in the Gaza Strip today. Now, they're wrong both factually, we've discussed that, but they're wrong both from a policy point of view and from the point of view of achieving a good goal. From a policy point of view, they're wrong because we could have had a ceasefire, as some people called for, as the head of the UN called for already in October 23, a ceasefire that leaves Hamas in power in Gaza, free to rearm, rebuild, and do another October 7th. Of course, that was always on the table. Any ceasefire that leaves Hamas in power is just kicking the can down the road. It doesn't solve anything, and we'll be back to square one in a year or two, and no Israeli will stand for that. I don't think any sane person should stand for that. A ceasefire with Hamas is just a Band-Aid solution, buys a certain amount of quiet, and in a year or two, we're back to square one, another war, another massacre against Israelis. It's just not going to happen. And I notice in their statement, they avoid the whole issue, right? They don't want to discuss that. But what they're calling for is a ceasefire that leaves Hamas in power. Second problem that they have is this is the irresponsible people talking. They have no responsibility. The real talks for a hostage release and a ceasefire have been led by the United States. And here I should remind you that some very significant countries, Germany and the Czech Republic, Hungary, refused to join this anti-Israel letter. Yeah, and I think we see who our real friends are in a situation like this. But the Americans are doing their serious work. Hamas is under a lot of pressure to agree to a ceasefire that is difficult for them, right? And here comes the so-called enlightened Western Europeans, the Brits, the French, the Spaniards, the Italians, and they're telling Hamas, you just hold out a bit longer, we're going to force Israel to do a unilateral ceasefire. Is that actually going to higher the chances or lower the chances of actually getting a deal that gets our hostages out and ending, having a ceasefire? In other words, these 28 leaders who signed the letter, the 28 countries and the European Union, are they actually helping bring about a ceasefire and hostage release? Or by giving Hamas succor, is that the right word? By giving Hamas, we have to hold out a bit longer and we'll get what we want. They'll end the war without us giving them back anything. We can even keep the hostages. We'll still get a ceasefire. They're actually being counterproductive to their own declared goals.
Well, their own declared goals. I don't believe a word they say ever, and they can't be taken seriously. But Hamas takes them very seriously. Hamas thanked them profusely for that letter, so we know that's what Hamas, and we know that. But here's the problem with what you said. Everything going on right now in Doha, Qatar, is encouraging Hamas. And that's why it's been going on for a month, where President Trump said any minute now. And each day Israel says, okay, so we'll allow that. Okay, we'll allow that. Hamas is just saying, nope. Why would Hamas give in on anything? And even if it agrees to what's on the table currently, do you realize not all the hostages will be released? There will be a 60-day ceasefire for Hamas to rebuild and rearm and do everything it can do, and there'll only be 10 living hostages released. And then what about the others? And the message it sends to all the jihadis in the world, look, you just kidnap people, and then you sit pretty. It doesn't matter, and it doesn't matter if your people starve. On the contrary, you want them to starve so you can, then you can weep. And the way you use them as human shields for missiles, you use them as human shields with the food. Exactly. Now, I told you that I tended to be optimistic recently, because I saw that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, I saw that after their amazing meeting in the White House, I thought thought that there was something going on that we weren't really aware of. But now, as time is dragging out, I'm seeing that there's no progress, and any progress that does get made is going to be a terrible deal, whatever happens. And Hamas knows it. And and you say the Europeans are encouraging. That letter encourages Hamas
Yeah.
not to give in. You're absolutely right. But so has Israel been giving that message, and so has the United States. Steve Witkoff, the message, not purposely, but the message has been anything, we'll do anything, just please agree. That's not a way to negotiate. And I have to say, I'm disappointed in President Trump and Steve Witkoff, two people who are really brilliant at, I don't know, real estate negotiations. They would never, ever do such a thing in the sale of a building or a purchase of a building. And so again, I'm praying that there's some kind of they have some idea in mind about how to get through all of this and how to get all the hostages. I don't know, but I got to say, right now, I'm very pessimistic about the whole thing.
So, as we speak, people are more upbeat about the success of these talks, though it's not done until it's done. I know that. You've expressed words of criticism of Trump and Witkoff. It's a process, though, that the Israeli government is part of.
I said as well.
Netanyahu is
Yes.
part of that, and it's the only serious process underway as we speak to get hostages out, and that will bring about some sort of a cessation of fighting for a declared part of time. I'd remind you there was a ceasefire in place in February that ended because Hamas stopped releasing hostages. Sorry, if more hostages would have been released, then the ceasefire could have continued. But here we need to say the following. These Europeans, once again, they've got no positive input whatsoever. If there is going to be a ceasefire and a hostage release, it's this American track. Unfortunately, the Europeans are just playing, silly games because they're undermining the American Witkoff track. They're actually not just undermining it, they're actually harming it, as I've explained. And I'd say to the Europeans, you say you stop the bloodshed, people are being killed and so forth. More people have been killed in the Ukraine. Are you calling for an immediate ceasefire there? Of course not. They know an immediate ceasefire there is against European interests because it will allow the Russians to stay exactly where they are at the moment. And so they're not only being bad for the process, they're being huge hypocrites. What they're saying is ceasefire with Hamas that allows Hamas to rearm, regroup, and attack us again.
Because they hate Israel. It's not even a question of hypocrisy in relation to Ukraine and Russia. You are talking about representatives of these countries who loathe Israel. Lammy, the foreign secretary of the UK, he is utterly, openly anti-Israel. And you have many of those governments that you named, the 25. They may cloak it in other language, but they don't even hide it anymore. They're anti-Israel. That is why they make an exception where Hamas is concerned.
I want to say I see it differently. I think a lot of it's sometimes from domestic politics, that there are groups, I know it from my time in the United Kingdom, which are very pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian, very anti-Israel. They're part of voters, both in Australia, both in Britain and in Canada. It's part of the constituency. And therefore, they are, in many ways, responding to these elements within their own countries, which is why if they would have called for a ceasefire with an agreed path for Hamas to to demilitarize Gaza and for Hamas to leave, right? We could have supported that.
But Mark, if you are kowtowing to constituents, I absolutely agree with what you said. Of course, it has to do with internal politics. But any government that kowtows to those elements, then you can say that that's an anti-Israel government. Because you could say, yes, they want to be elected. But if that's how you're elected on the basis of those voices, well, then I have every right to say that the UK has become anti-Israel. Totally every right, because those are not the voices that any politician, any moral politician with any kind of sense of democracy in the world and anti-jihadi sentiment has no business being considered anything other than anti-Israel. That's why I said that.
So I agree with what you said before. I don't agree with everything you say, but I agree with You said before the most important thing is that Israel wins this. And I think that's 100% correct. Winning it means we achieve the goals that were articulated by the government as the strategy. And that is, when this is over, Hamas can no longer pose a threat to Israel. Gaza can no longer pose a threat to Israel. Basically, we have to see a demilitarized Gaza Strip, and we have to see all the hostages home. And I think over the last few weeks, we've been moving ahead on those goals, and Hamas is feeling the price. And that's why I think it's possible that they'll build this American brokered ceasefire deal, which will bring out a large part of the hostages, half of them. And maybe in the framework of the negotiations afterwards, there'll be more hostages released, and maybe Hamas, I mean, this is too far, but I'm sure this is the American hope, that there can be diplomatic arrangements are reached where Hamas actually does leave. If not, we will go back in and finish the job. But there'll be a clear, if these talks succeed, there'll be a clear diplomatic option on the table. Last time, it didn't work. Hamas refused to release more hostages. Hamas was clear that it wanted to stay and fight. If Hamas decides it wants to stay and fight, the war will go on and we will win.
Well, it's funny you say there could be some path to a diplomatic move. And the title of our show suggests, I prefer to say there should be an undiplomatic move to solve this.
I like to say, when Trump used to talk about the Iranian issue, maybe he still talks this way, I shouldn't say used to. He used to say, well, they're not going to get a bomb and they can't have enrichment, and we can do it the nice way or the tough way,
The
right?
hard way, yeah.
Yeah, and so that's my message to Hamas, right? This can be done the nice way or the tough way.
Except there weren't hostages sitting
Yeah.
there in front of the nuclear sites. That's in Iran. That's a problem here. And we care so much about every individual human being being starved and beaten in those tunnels and in the homes of supposed Gazan civilians that we just can't do it. There's no question that there are other countries that would have long ago said, well, we have to sacrifice the hostages, and Israelis won't do it. And I'm not saying we should, but that is why we're in this situation. And rather than get backing from Europe and others who should be natural friends, and rather than the hostage families being at least understanding that that's what Netanyahu is trying to do, all they do is attack him for not bringing them back.
And here's another level of European hypocrisy or double standard, whatever you want to call it. Remember when Trump was being nice to Putin and trying to get a deal in the Ukraine, and the Europeans said very loudly, well, there's no equality between aggressor and between the person who's the victim of aggression, and there's no equality between a democracy, which is Ukraine supposedly, and between Russia, which is an authoritarian regime. Hello, we are fighting. Israel is a democracy. We have faults, but we're a democracy. I know you don't like it when I say we have faults, but I have no trouble saying we.
When did I think
You once
Israel's
told me
filled
off you
with
don't like it
faults?
when Israelis say they have faults because the other side is much worse. But let's stop. You won't say that in the previous.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah. We're a democracy. We're fighting an authoritarian/totalitarian terrorist movement, which is supported by people like the Iranians, not known for being democratic, Hezbollah, not known for being democratic, Houthis, right? Why does that, we have to support the Ukrainians because they're democratic. Why does that not apply to the Jews? I fail to understand.
Well, you know the answer to that, Mark, why it doesn't apply to the Jews. Thank you very much. Someone who reads history books for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, okay? You know very well why. And we don't even have to use the word. And I think on that cheerful, or I would say sad note, maybe, we will wrap up today's broadcast, and then we'll pick up where we left off next week.
I look forward to that, Ruthie. See you then.